Welcome to Indian Cooking with Suganti. In this video, we're going to visit a floating island, a mysterious floating island in Fiji Island. Hi everyone, welcome back to Indian Cooking with Suganti. Today we are not going to cook, but I'm going to take you to Fiji Islands. In Fiji Islands, we visited many places, but this one is very interesting. This is called a floating island, and everyone was saying there is a floating island and there's a lot of mysteries surrounding it. And I heard a lot of stories about it. I really wanted to go and see the floating island by myself. It's 6 o'clock in the morning in Labasa. We are waiting just outside the Grand Eastern Hotel where we are staying. We are waiting for the taxi driver to come and pick us up and take us to the floating island.
Good morning, Kaushik.
On the way to the floating island, we're going to pass by a temple. They say there is a stone in the shape of a snake. People say the snake stone has healing powers, and they say it keeps growing. You see the red and yellow building? That's the Nagmandir. Nag in Hindi language is snake. Mandir means temple.
There's a cave somewhere in front. It's not really very. Only thin people can go, but they haven't been fired.
Oh,
They have to come back.
fire comes out.
Oh. And this one is somehow linked with the floating island there.
Floating. Okay. Our friend Kaushik, he's saying that there is a connection between the Nagmandir and the floating island, and he lives in Labasa. So he's familiar with the stories around this two places. And he says there is a cave in this Nagmandir, which is a very small cave, only thin people can go in. And he says when people try to go in, fire comes out of that. So no one was able to go deep into the cave to explore further. Nice paved road is ended. Now we are driving on a gravel road. It's bumpy and rough. Just pay attention to the plants and the trees on the roadside. You will see the same kind of plants and trees on the island and surrounding the island around the pond.
This road is known as Kilikoso Road. Kilikoso Road.
Oh, okay. There is a river flowing here. This is not too far from the floating island. The ocean is also not too far from this place. So definitely there is a huge waterbed beneath the ground. We drove for about an hour and a half. The island is very close by now. We're almost there. The land seems very wet with tall grasses, and it's a marshland. We have to walk in some muddy road to reach the floating island. The path is so narrow and very slippery. And it's so wet and there are lots of holes. You have to be very careful where you place your feet. We reached. This is the island. See, it's there.
Move होते पता नहीं लगे ना कि move हुए.
So यहाँ किनारे यहाँ जाई तब जाना यहाँ.
See, it was
Yeah, it
there.
was here.
There. It seems last week the island was on the right end of the pond. Now it's to the left.
Yeah. यहाँ पे रहा.
So it was here.
This
Closer
is the
to.
distance it moved.
See, that is here.
It was here.
It was here. And then now it moved.
रोज घस के कैसे नहीं पता ना.
Every day
moved
gas
there.
Every day.
Around 12.
Kaushik says last week the pond was to the right end of the pond, close to the edge, and he was able to step onto the island.
अच्छा.
The whole thing looks like a pond and a piece of land. It's about 60 feet long with lots of plants and trees on top and about 30 feet wide is floating, very slowly floating on the pond. And that's the floating island.
You come to fish here.
And there are a lot of mysteries and stories surrounding this island. No one seemed to know how this was formed. Unfortunately, I could not meet any older people who could have given me more information on this island, the early stages of this island. They say there was a native guy who jumped into this pond, never came back. After a few days, they found his body floating.
His body was discovered after a few days. And one time, I don't know whether it was a guy from New Zealand or somewhere, he tried to tie both the lands. That one and this one. There was one coconut tree that time, that side. And one was this side. As the chain broke, the fella passed away.
कौन सी बांध तारा?
He died.
नारियल पेड़ था यार, पहले टाइम पे.
That, and then he tied the island to the nariyal bed.
A tree on the island to the nariyal pear.
Kaushik is saying somebody tried to tie a coconut tree on the island to a coconut tree on the land, and then the chain broke and then the guy died.
कौन सी है? हम जनता ये पेड़ के हम देखा है.
सलू का जो नुलों सूकी बना हुआ है.
Oh, ये वाला है, right.
So trying to tie the island to the banks is like trying to stop an elephant from running by tying it to a broomstick. You cannot just see it, but the pull of the island is very strong. The guy must have died of a catapult effect. You know, when you hold a catapult and when you pull the string and when you release it, what happens? The stone gets thrown away, right? I think that's what must have happened. The chain and the trees must have formed like a catapult, and maybe he was holding the trees together. The chain must have broken because of the powerful pull of the island. When the chain broke, he must have been thrown away with force and died. Keep watching. Make a mark on the island and something on the land, and you can see the distance expanding and you can see the island moving. I'm standing on the same place holding the camera, focusing on the island to see if the island is moving.
This
tree and the little tree, you can see the distance expanding. And the edge also. Here the edge also.
वो बहुत रुक गया, नोटिस कर रहा
You can see
यार.
it's moving.
right. ऐसे जावे. तो बहुत ही रकम जाए.
हाँ.
Yeah, it is moving.
But कैसे move हुई?
वही तो आज ले उसके नहीं पता लगा.
काफी move हुई यार जब से मंगाया.
हाँ. एकदम उधर पहुँचेला है.
Yeah, it's going
So
to
to reach at the end.
Right. ऐसे घूमे.
हाँ.
By the end of this video, you will have all your questions answered and all your doubts cleared. On the water surface, you can see some water creatures making trails. Some are long, some are small, some jumps up and goes in. That could be fish and water snakes. So swimming may be safer on the surface, but definitely not diving, because the depth of this pond is much deeper than you can imagine. I looked at the whole thing in a scientific way. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a geologist, I'm a math major. So that's it. I'm not here to disprove anybody's religious belief. This is just my views, what I think is happening.
जैसे नहीं propel करे उसके. जैसे उसके कुछ ढकेल के ले जावे. धीरे-धीरे
Look at the trees. That must be the roots must be so long, no?
I have no idea उसके कितना island के
कितना नीचे ले उसके मट्टी है ना.
Yeah. My husband Arvind and Kaushik are wondering if there is a big land mass under the island, and how come the island is moving, dragging that much of weight on top and beneath the water.
एक जो सूखा वाला जो ब्रांच है वो यहाँ पे हम यहाँ से दिखता रहा उसको तो हम देखा पेड़ के से आड़ते जाएगा यहाँ आएगा दूसरा साइड आएगा हमें तो यहाँ से दिखा हुआ है
कुछ ना वे थोड़े के लिए ऊपर आके दिखाया हुआ बट कौन सी पहुड़े नहीं जानू
ओ वहाँ पे
हाँ
राइट पानी खेले
हाँ
मछली है
पता नहीं
हाँ
ऊपर आके देखे यू सेड
हाँ नहीं ऐसे थोड़ा सा दिखाया फिर चले भीतर
ओह
काफी मूव हो गए
काफी यहाँ ये पेड़ नहीं हट गया
हम ये जो ग्रीन पेड़ नहीं है उसके पीछे जो आइलैंड में जो एक दिखा हुआ जो ब्राउन ला फर्स्ट वाला उसके अच्छा यहाँ पे ईस्ट साइड राइट हैंड साइड रहा तो हम उसके देखते रहे बीच में आइस अब ये ईस्ट साइड आएगी पूरा घूम गया
See from here we were able to see the tip of that edge, the left hand side edge. Now it's
हम खाली एक माका रख के बैठा रहा वो घस सकते हैं
I was watching the distance between this tree, this tree, and this little tree on the island.
You can see it move.
So this is on the island, and this is on the shore.
Take one marker and just.
This is on the shore, and here water, and this little tree is on the island. You can see the distance expanding.
नहीं इधर ये पेड़ के इधर आएगी पूरा.
Since the time we started to notice, it moved about 7-8 feet. Let's see how the island is floating. According to the scientist Archimedes, he says when an object is immersed in water fully or partially, the water displaced by the weight of the object, if that weight equals to the upward force from underneath the water. If that equals, then the object floats. Let's do a simple experiment.
Oh yeah.
I have a lemon here. It's kind of heavy, quite heavy. And I have water filled up to this level. The law of flotation is if an object is fully or partially immersed in water, the weight of the water displaced by the object, if that weight equals to the force from underneath the water that's pushing the object upwards. If both are equal, then the item will float. But if the water displaced is heavier than the force, the object will sink. Okay, let's see what happens. Okay. See, the lemon is floating. It's not going down. Let me try to push this one down. See? I'm holding it down, but once I leave it, it just comes up. Why? That's the force. That's the upward thrust from within the water, pushing the object upwards. And the water displaced, do you see that? How much water displaced? The water level has gone up here, from here to here. So this is called the displaced water. If that water, the weight of the water, equals to the buoyant force, the upward thrust, item float. This is the basic scientific reason behind the floating island. You can see the lemon, just the top part above the water level, and most of the lemon, it's underneath the water. I think the same thing is happening with the floating island. I'm sure there's a big mass of soil underneath the island that's still floating, and what you see is just the top part. Next, let's see how it moves around in the pond. There comes the Newton's law of motion, the third law of motion, which is for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. When the island moves around, when it comes and hits the edge of the pond, the edge produces an equal and opposite reaction onto the island, and the island gets pushed away from the edge of the pond. Then it slowly moves away, and when the island goes and hits the other side of the pond, same thing happens. The pond exerts an equal force onto the island gets pushed away. Same thing happening, and then that's why the island keeps moving in the pond. The direction of the movement of the island depends on the way it touches the edge of the pond. Which part of the island touches the edge and how it touches. And depending on that, it takes the direction and then moves around in different directions. You may not see the island actually coming and touching the edge of the pond. The land underneath the island may be wider than the island, so that part must be coming and hitting the edge of the pond and get pushed away. The island is moving so slowly because of the weight it's carrying underneath the water. Let's look at this video. What I'm trying to explain here is the island that we are seeing floating on the water could be just the tip of a wider landmass underneath the water that we do not see. When I explained how the island is moving along on the pond, I had used the law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And I had said the edge of the island must be coming and hitting the edge of the pond and gets pushed away because of the opposite, equal and opposite reaction, right? You might say that you never seen the island's edge coming and touching the edge of the pond. That may be the land underneath the water may be a little wider than the island itself. So the wider part of the island must be coming and touching the edge of the pond under the water that you don't see. So, and then it gets pushed away. This soil landmass is not going to remain the same. It's eroding constantly, slowly. The water has so much of power. It erodes slowly. So it will erode, and eventually you'll see the island moving a little easier with less weight and coming and hitting the pond, and could move a little faster. As this weight becomes less, you'll see the island moving a little faster. I have visited sinkholes and underground caves in Mexico, US, Caribbean and Hawaii, and with that experience, my conclusion is I think the whole formation was created by a sinkhole. What is a sinkhole? Next, let's see how the sinkholes are formed. So here you see the top, this part shows the ground we walk. Okay, and then underneath there are bedrocks, and sometimes underneath the ground you'll have some clay, layer of clay, and then you see different layers of rocks. These are called the layers of bedrocks. So this may be one kind of layer of rocks, and this one layer of rocks, and there could be underground water flowing also. Sometimes under the caves, and there are a lot of live river flowing. So they could be underground water source. And then this is the limestone layer. Wherever there are seas around, ocean close by, and there's a possibility of having a limestone layer under the ground. Limestone layer dissolves quickly. The limestone is very soft and it dissolves in water very easily. This is how the sinkholes form, with the dissolving of the limestones. What happens when the rain falls, and when it passes through the ground, and also the groundwater also, what happens, mixes with the minerals in the ground, and it becomes acidic. And then there are a lot of cracks on the ground, we all know. And then the water seeps through the cracks and then goes down into the bedrocks, and it reaches the limestone. When it reaches the limestone layer, the limestone started to dissolve. They started to dissolve and disappear. And some places disappear faster, creating a hollowness underground. So wherever there is hollowness underground, the ground on top just sinks in, just gives in, and then sinks down. And that's how sinkholes are formed. And then if the whole layer of limestone dissolve, if the whole layer dissolves and disappear, it leaves a hollowness underground, just hollowness and emptiness. And that's how the underground caves are formed. These are dry sinkholes because there is no underground water bed. There's no water source underneath. So water doesn't get to fill the holes. So they remain dry, but a big deep hole. And if you look at this is called the blue hole. Blue holes are sinkholes near the coast, and the holes are filled with blue seawater. This is a sinkhole happening in Florida. Florida is a state of sinkholes. There are hundreds of sinkholes, and this happened in 2017. Let's watch. See how a house just sucked into the sinkhole. The whole house, everything just sank into a hole. The underground water erodes the soil underneath the house, eventually eroding the foundation of the house, and the house could not stand on the ground anymore. It just sinks into the hole. And this is just the first house, and a few houses around this house also sank into the hole. And this is how the sinkhole works. And do you see the force of the water coming from underneath?
Damn. Ven acá y se lo pasa a nosotros. ¿Y se lo pasa a nosotros?
Three sides of Florida surrounded by water, and it has a lot of lakes and marshlands and rivers flowing. So there are a lot of underground water. So what happens is the limestone layer dissolves, creating a vacuum, and the water fills the gap and erodes the foundation of the house, and the house sinks. After several houses were sucked into this sinkhole, it looks like this. This is how the sinkhole looks now. And the whole place is fenced around, and people cannot enter or go near the sinkhole because the land is very soft, and it's very dangerous for people to walk around. Now let's study the floating island in Labasa, Fiji. Look at the plants on the land here. These are some kind of plants, and then here the ferns and the trees here. These are all on the land. Look in the island, same kind of plants. And there are a lot of big trees, and the same kind of fans like here. And this plant is same as the land one on the land. And it's all almost similar plants. And there could have been a coconut tree here also. I was told there was a coconut tree there. And there were some coconut trees on the land also here. It shows this part of land was once all together. Before the sinkhole happened, this was all just one piece of land. A picture can speak 1,000 words. I made some sketches, and this is going to explain what must have happened and what might happen in the future. Before the floating island was born, this is how the land must have looked. The land around the floating island, this is how it must have looked, with all tall grasses grown everywhere, with soggy land and wet land. And in one corner where the floating island is right now, there must have been a lot of trees and bushes growing. And these are all the ferns you'll see, and the coconut trees and the silica trees. You can still see the same kind of plants and trees on the island and around the pond. Keep in mind, there is a waterbed under this ground. With ocean close by and rivers flowing nearby, there's a waterbed. And wherever there's ocean, there's a 100% possibility there's a limestone layer beneath the ground. When the limestone rocks dissolve and creates a hollowness, the water from under the ground, it seeps through and it just starts to erode the soil. So here what must have happened? The soil must have started to erode from underneath, and then you see where there aren't much plants, that must have started to erode first. The soil underneath must have started to erode first, and the soil underneath the trees must be eroding also, but in a slower rate, because of the roots of these trees must be holding the soil together. So the erosion is happening slowly in this area. But in this area, there are just grass, tall grass, not much root system. So the crack must have started here, like this. These are the cracks because of the erosion of the soil underneath by the underground water. And wherever there were cracks, that must have eventually, the soil completely must have eroded and collapsed down into the hole. And the water must have filled that gap. So this is how it must have looked one time before the island was born. So water filled this area first, a larger piece of land with trees still attached to the mainland. Remember, this is my views. I'm not a geologist. This is what I think must have happened. Next, like I said, erosion is happening under this land also, but the roots are holding the soil tightly, so the erosion is happening slowly. So I'm sure there must have been places, spots on the piece where there's not much root system, not much plants. Those places must have started to crack at the edge of the land. So eventually what happens? These cracks must have widened, pieces must have split away from the mainland, become 3 different islands. See, this is what must have happened. So there must have been islands, small islands must have been floating before the big island was formed. After the formation of the smaller islands, the big piece that was still attached to the land must have started to crack where there were not much root system. Then water must have eroded the soil from underneath. So next, the crack must have become wider and wider, and finally, due to erosion, the land around it must have collapsed into the pond, thus detaching the main piece of land away from the edge of the pond, creating a new big island. So at one point of time, there must be more than one island floating, and in the bigger island, you can see a lot of trees. So the trees are holding that bigger land piece together. And I think one point the pond must have been a little smaller, and then the edges must be collapsing over time and making the pond into a bigger piece. And also the island itself, the big island itself, the edges must be collapsing also slowly, that you may not see. At the beginning when the island was formed, it must be a little bigger than what you're seeing now. So the edges must be slowly eroding and falling into the pond, shrinking the island. By looking at the plants on the banks of the pond, this side and then on the big island, you can see that the big island was once attached to this side of the pond, and then it got detached and became an island. The smaller piece of islands that are floating might not had that many trees to hold them together, so eventually they must have collapsed into the pond. This picture shows the current scenario. This is what you're seeing right now, a big piece of land, one single piece of land floating in the pond. But remember, erosion is still happening underneath. And then they said there was a coconut tree on the island, and you don't see the coconut tree now. What must have happened is coconut tree has a real long, strong root system. Erosion must have eroded the soil between the roots, exposing the roots to the water. So what happens? The roots decay and it's get rotten, and it just melts away. And once the root is gone, the tree falls down. It dies and vanishes. So erosion is happening underneath this island also. So eventually there will be cracks on this. This is my prediction. The island is not going to remain the same. Several things could happen to the island. One scenario could be it could crack and split into small islands, or else the edges could just dissolve and the island could shrink smaller and smaller, and then eventually it could just dissolve into the sinkhole. So in this scenario, I'm showing cracks happening on the island. There are spots on the island. There are many plants. Those places going to crack because of the erosion from underneath, going to crack and split into different islands. And when will this happen? I don't know. A geologist will have an answer to that question. It could happen in a couple of years, or in 50 years, 100 years, or several hundreds of years. We don't know. I would like to warn people who like to hop onto the island. You just have to be very careful. Due to erosion, there must be a lot of soft spots on the island where there are no plants. So you have to be very careful where you put your feet. If you put your feet on the soft spots, you're going to go down into the sinkhole and it's going to be deadly. Eventually, the cracks could widen, splitting the island into pieces. And what will happen next is the trees will vanish because the erosion is constantly happening underneath. It's going to erode all the soil, exposing the roots of the trees, and the roots going to rot and the trees going to fall. Once the trees are gone and the roots are gone, the island is going to erode very fast. The soil is going to erode quickly, and eventually all the islands will just fall into the hole. There won't be any more islands but just a pond. Not just a pond, it's a sinkhole. It's a deep sinkhole. So that's my prediction. Other prediction is the edges of the island could erode and collapse into the hole and shrinking the island into smaller. It might become smaller and smaller, and once the trees die, the whole island will sink down. After the island sinks into the sinkhole, you will see one big pond. The water will fill in, you will see a huge pond. So that will be the end of this floating island. And at the same time, the size of the pond is going to expand. At the edge of the pond, the land will collapse and making the pond wider and bigger. Okay, so that's my prediction. But one thing the local government should do is fence this whole area. The edges are very soft and it's very dangerous for people to go even near the pond. So I would suggest somebody from the local government pay attention to this and have a geologist do research on this and put a fence. Before they just put a fence and keep people away from this pond. And jumping onto the island, it's very dangerous. Next, let's see what could be underneath the pond, inside the deep sinkhole. I drew the cross section of the sinkhole above and under the ground. A local from here said they catch fish in the pond that live in sweet water. So maybe the top layer may be sweet water, but definitely underneath in the sinkhole must be salt water because of the ocean nearby. And some caves even have poisonous gas in the sinkhole. A layer of poisonous gas can be found in the sinkhole. So people with no proper gear, if they think they're an expert swimmer, and if they dive into the hole, once they reach the bottom, it's going to be very dark. And they won't be able to see the top part of the pond. And they're going to get very disoriented and they won't be able to come back at all. It's going to be deadly. They can even hold their breath and go through the poisonous gas layer, but they won't be able to come back up. And that's how the native who dived into this hole must have died. So you just cannot jump into the sinkhole without proper gear and without oxygen. There must be water currents underneath. The sinkhole is filled with water, so I'm sure there is huge water bed underneath this sinkhole. I'm sure there is a cave system. I think the layer of limestone completely eroded, creating a cave underneath. So I'm sure there is a cave underneath the sinkhole, maybe fully filled with water or partially filled with water. And people say there is a connection between the Nagmandir and the floating island. I believe there is a possibility, there is a connection. I think there is a cave connecting the Nagmandir and the floating island. And people say when somebody tried to go into the cave, fire comes out of the cave. I think there must be some hot springs underneath. When we went to Sao, that has a lot of hot springs. Hot springs are all volcanic activities. It's not that there's a volcano underneath, but there's a volcanic activity happening. So when people go in, what they experience is steam coming out of the hot springs. That's what I believe. There may be some hot springs underneath. They just feel the heat. The heat could be so strong it could burn your face. So maybe that's why they're saying fire comes out. Okay. So there is a possibility there is a cave system connecting the Nagmandir and the island. In this picture, it looks like the cave and the Nagmandir are close, but in fact, there are several miles apart, the floating island and the Nagmandir. So there must be a cave underneath, several miles long. And I visited a lot of caves and sinkholes, and with that experience, I'm thinking this is what must have happened. That's it. I really enjoyed vacationing in Fiji, and I would like to go back again. There's so much to see. Next, I want to visit Tavioni. Looking forward to see more interesting places and beautiful places. I hope you enjoyed my video. Like I mentioned, this video, the intention of this video is not to hurt anybody's feeling or not to disprove anybody's belief. Okay, this is just my views, my vision. And like I said, I looked at it in a scientific way. And that's it. That's all. Just want to share my views with you guys. I'm not asking everybody to believe what I said in this video. Okay? And I will be back soon with more interesting videos, travel videos and cooking videos. Take care and thank you for watching. Next I'm going to post a video on Nagmandir. Please look forward to it. And please subscribe to my channel. If you haven't subscribed, please click the subscribe button. Subscription is 100% free. You don't have to pay any money at all, ever. And also click the bell button. Please share the video with your family and friends. Please ask them to subscribe to my channel. And I will be back soon. Until then, take care and thank you for watching.